Chapter number 3, Part 2. Now, students, no bickering, Mrs. Brisbane told them. Let's go back to our places. I hopped off my wheel and I settled down in that fresh bedding. Phoebe raised her hand and Mrs. Brisbane called on her. Did you say we all get to take Humphrey home? At one time or another, yes, was the answer. Phoebe's face lit up. If you don't get a turn right away, don't you worry, the teacher continued. You'll get him eventually, as long as your parents sign a permission form. After all, families don't always have time for a hamster on the weekend. Phoebe's smile faded away. But I think I was the only one that noticed. I was the only one smiling when Mrs. Brisbane asked the students who'd like to take me home, and every single hand went up. Maybe these new humans weren't quite so strange as I thought. Later, Mrs. Brisbane rearranged the seating in the classroom. First, she had everyone take their belongings to the sides of the room. Then she told each student where to sit. There were a few groans, but mostly the kids settled down without complaint until Mrs. Brisbane went back to teaching and made some notes on the board. And suddenly a hand began waving. Teacher, teacher! Mrs. Brisbane looked up. Please call me Mrs. Brisbane, she said. Please call me. What is it, Kelsey? We can't see with him there. She pointed to tall Paul, who was seated directly in front of her. I could imagine it would be hard to see with Paul G blocking her view. My mistake, Mrs. Brisbane said. I must have gotten the Pauls mixed up. Paul Green, could you switch with Paul Fletcher? Okay. Tall Paul gathered his belongings and moved toward the side of the room. Small Paul picked up his notebook and backpack and moved toward the front of the room. He wouldn't block anyone's view. Somewhere in the middle, they almost walked into each other. Watch out! I squeaked. Everyone laughed, except the two Pauls. They carefully avoided walking into each other, and I noticed they also avoided looking at each other. Now, can you see, Kelsey? Mrs. Brisbane asked. I can see fine, Kelsey answered. Mrs. Brisbane continued with her lesson, but I couldn't concentrate. I was watching the two Pauls staring down at their desk. I was glad when the school bell rang at the end of the day and only Mrs. Brisbane, Og, and I were left in the room. Whew, it had been a tiring day. Like most hamsters, I sleep more during the day than at night, but with so much going on, I hadn't got much napping done. But there was no time to sleep now. I needed time to myself to try to figure things out. I was deep in thought when I heard a familiar, friendly voice. I survived, the voice said. Congratulations, Mrs. Brisbane replied. I scampered up to a tree branch near the top of my cage as one of my favorite humans, Mrs. Mack, entered the room. Mrs. Mack was beautiful. Mrs. Mack was sweet. Mrs. Mack was amazing. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Mack, I would probably be living at boring old Petorama, hoping that someone would give me a real home. Mrs. Mack found me there, and she brought me to room 26. And then she went to Brazil for a while, and I had to learn to live with Mrs. Brisbane. I wasn't too sure about her at first, but she turned out to be a great teacher. Now Mrs. Mack was back, but where had she been all day? She sank into the chair next to Mrs. Brisbane's desk. I have a lot to learn, she said. You'll be fine, Mrs. Brisbane assured her, but first grade isn't easy. So that's where Mrs. Mack was. She was teaching first grade at Longfellow School. It's exciting, but there's so much to teach them, Mrs. Mack continued. I wish I had Humphrey and Og to help. She glanced over our way and waved. Hi, guys, she said. Hi, Mrs. Mack. You'll be great at first grade. Mark my words. I squeaked with encouragement while Og splashed loudly in his tank. How did your day go? Mrs. Mack asked Mrs. Brisbane. I think it will be a good year, Mrs. Brisbane said. Want to grab a cup of coffee? "Would I?" Mrs. Mack answered. While Mrs. Brisbane gathered up her things, Mrs. Mack came over to see Og and me. She leaned down close to my cage, and I saw her big, happy smile in her sparkling eyes. She smelled like apples. "Maybe I can borrow you once in a while," she whispered. "I hope so," I whispered back, but unfortunately, I know all she heard was a very soft squeak. Then Og and I were alone, left to think about the strange happenings of the first day of school. "Thomas does exaggerate," I said to my neighbor. "I think that fish story was a tall tale." "Boing," he answered. "Phoebe is very forgetful, but Holly is very, very helpful," I added. "Boing," he said again. "I wonder why Harry can't hurry up," I said, after a little more thinking. "Boing, boing," my friend replied. "But I don't have time to worry about these strange students," I continued, "because I'm busy worrying about what happened to my real friends from room 26, the ones from last year." I was silent for a few seconds, and then I squeaked what was really on my mind. "Am I ever going to see them again?" Humphrey's Rules of School. Treat hamsters the way you'd like to be treated, which includes telling them where their new friends have gone. The end. We'll see what happens next time in chapter number 4.